Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I know I haven't been doing videos for a little while, but I'm pretty excited to be joined by Philippa. Hello.
Hi.
And I'm going to do just a little bit of setup for you guys because I think it's going to be kind of important to understand. We're going to be talking about what's known as lean mass hyperresponders. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Many of you who follow my work probably already know this pretty well, but in case you didn't, for many who go on a low-carb diet, and by many, really, I mean a fraction of the total, but there are some people who are especially lean and or athletic who especially go very low-carb and tend to see this phenotype, which I wrote about 3 years ago, which I was seeing this pattern quite a bit. For example, having LDL cholesterol of 200 milligrams per deciliter or higher, HDL of 80 or higher, and triglycerides of 70 or lower. Any of these three by themselves are already extremely rare. So it's even that much more incredible that all three of them together would be a common enough phenotype that not only did that article get a lot of response, but it's now become pretty central to my research. And we even have a Facebook group that we set up for lean mass hyperresponders. We're now, I think it's somewhere around 5,000 members. It's crazy just how many there are. And that's also how I met you, Philippa. And so why don't you, actually before you get started, I want to kind of say one other thing too, which is, let me first be sure I can stop my screen share here, which is that you would say that your opinion kind of runs counter against probably the majority of the lean mass hyperresponder group, in that they sort of share a little bit more of my sentiment that we're, I guess many would say that they're cautiously optimistic about this phenotype, that perhaps being a lean mass hyperresponder may, if anything, be neutral or even beneficial. You're not so sure about that, right?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about it. And I think my perspective is slightly different from some in that I'm not so focused on the numbers. So a lot of the concerns, obviously very high cholesterol numbers, you're going to get heart disease, that sort of thing, because of the high cholesterol. What I'm more concerned about is the high cholesterol numbers a manifestation of some underlying hormonal dysregulation? And
Right.
is actually that what we need to be concerned about?
And let me just pause you there, because basically I want to set up that I'm very interested, particularly for anybody in the group who has a different opinion than mine, that might have a different model as to why it is that this phenotype might appear. And it's the one thing I'm very proud of for that group, is that we've managed to remain generally science-centric, I think, and not so much advocacy-centric. And part of how you do that is you do exactly what we're doing today, which is to try to engage other opinions, especially if they have one that's very different than everybody else. And Philippa, part of the reason I had you on is because you've put a lot of effort, I think, into researching this subject and sort of developing your own theory, even if it is one that is currently in development. So go ahead and get us started. How did you get connected to the group in the first place? What brought you to the Lean Mass Hyperresponder Facebook group?
Okay, so my husband had a TIA, which is a mini stroke, in January 2018. At the time, he was hypertensive, so he had high blood pressure, he had abdominal obesity, he was certainly insulin resistant, generally unhealthy. And as the process of trying to get him healthy after that, we discovered keto, low carb, fasting. He lost an awful lot of weight, normalized his blood pressure, resolved acid reflux, many other sort of problems. And quite a complicated journey on the way, but for many months his cholesterol was sort of around 5 and a bit millimolar, which I can't do the translation, but like slightly higher than your doctors would like, but not massively high. And obviously, being in the low carb world, I was kind of familiar with your work. I come across your videos, I was kind of into it, but for a long time it wasn't really relevant because his cholesterol wasn't really that high. It was never a level that I, would have been concerning to me. And then at some point his cholesterol started to really rise, and I think the highest I got the numbers here, hold on, I have to look them up. The highest his LDL got was 7 millimoles, which is 271 milligrams per deciliter. His trigs were low, his HDL was high, he started to look like a lean mass hyperresponder. And so at that time I became a lot more interested in it because it was suddenly really relevant. And probably around that time, I started being part of the group, I'm not sure when. And sort of long story short, what I discovered eventually was that he had really quite a subtle underlying thyroid dysfunction. Once we normalized the thyroid function, his LDL massively came down. So the lowest it came down to, LDL was 1.76 millimolar, which is 68 milligrams per deciliter. HDL still remaining good, trig still remaining good. So that really crystallized for me, and it's a slightly long story, but it was almost fortuitous that I discovered that there was a thyroid issue there, because he certainly never, it would never have been picked up unless I was tracking things really quite carefully and putting a few pieces of puzzle together. For example, his TSH, which is a normal measure of thyroid function, it never went above 4. And the normal range is below 5. So it would never have been picked up by anybody in general, but it did turn out to really be the main reason why his cholesterol was high. And so on the background of that, and because he still has some issues, so he has a low hemoglobin, which can't be put down to any of the normal causes. And slightly low hemoglobin, low red cell count is also something that we see in a significant number of lean mass hyperresponders. And so I've carried on sort of being involved with the lean mass hyperresponder group and being interested in it, particularly because I feel like it may still hold some clues as to sort of the ongoing struggles that I'm having to optimize his health. But that was really sort of what led me in to the group, and also what made me think that possibly there's something else underlying this, rather than just sort of just being, fueled by fat.
Now, you yourself, you were already keen to be looking in the direction of the thyroid, because you, and I think this precedes your husband's history, you already were working with some thyroid issues of your own. Is that right?
Yeah, so I've had Hashimotos Thyroiditis for many years. I'm on thyroid replacement therapies. So yeah, so thyroid was on my radar, but it's, and I was aware of the connection with cholesterol, but as I say, it was quite a surprise to me, even thinking that I knew something about thyroid problems, that sort of he ended up having, that the thyroid ended up having that much effect on his cholesterol. And that's what really led me to believe that I think the low carbness and the leanness and any possible underlying thyroid dysfunction really have a very sort of multiplicative effect on the cholesterol, because under normal circumstances, even someone with raging hypothyroidism, really low thyroid function, they wouldn't necessarily see those levels of cholesterol that we are seeing in the lean mass hyperresponder group. So it seems to be an interaction potentially there.
So you would posit, or I feel like, and not to overly simplify your hypothesis, you think that actually a substantial number of lean mass hyperresponders basically may, or you're concerned that they may have a dysfunctional thyroid system. Would you say that's correct?
I think that's a definite possibility. I mean, we know that we have a lot of people in the Facebook group who do have thyroid dysfunction, who will talk about their thyroid meds and that sort of thing. I am getting a little bit more of the opinion that we have probably quite a heterogeneous group in the lean mass hyperresponders. I don't think perhaps the etiology of the high cholesterol for all of them is the same. And so I think there will be definitely a chunk of them who have overt thyroid disease that are sort of, not optimally controlled on medication, which is difficult to do anyway. There's probably a section like my husband who have very mild covert thyroid dysfunction that they may never really realize that they had, but nonetheless might be contributing to their thyroid numbers when they're low carb. And then I think there's potentially I know that you've said before that if people stay low carb long enough and get lean enough and are healthy enough, then they will turn into lean mass hyperresponders, that you can almost kind of put bets on it.
I think most of them is my current hypothesis. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the other sort of side to that is, I think an awful lot of people, the etiology is possibly one of being too lean and undereating or overtraining and being in a state of relative energy deficiency. And whether that effect on the cholesterol is entirely mediated by thyroid, or whether it's mediated equally or as well by other factors such as low leptin, which again we know influences the thyroid axis, or low levels of IGF-1, which again we know is associated with higher cholesterol. That I don't know. I mean, that's definitely a mystery. We know that obviously in fasting and in low carb diets, levels of what's sometimes called the active thyroid hormone T3 drop quite a lot. Free T3 drops, but total T3 drops more. There's still many questions over sort of the mechanism of that and the whether that represents any form of low thyroid signaling in different parts of the body, but that may well be one axis. But as I say, that there may be something specifically to do with potentially leptin and just IGF-1 and reduced anabolic signaling in general, that sort of, I mean, you can't really split them apart because the thyroid hormones are part of anabolic signaling.
Right.
But yeah, it may be that obviously, if we take the principle that if you get lean enough, you will become a lean mass hyperresponder, then it wouldn't make any sense that, all the people that manage to get really lean just happen to all be people with thyroid dysfunction. That wouldn't make any sense. And so I suspect there's something about being lean enough, under eating, overtraining, being in a state of relative energy deficiency, that is enough to cause your cholesterol to go particularly high if you're on a low carb diet for some people.
Well, I think that our theories aren't mutually exclusive. You probably know my energy model well enough to know just the broad view of it, right?
Yeah.
So certainly one major component to my hypothesis is that effectively, in order for there to be higher turnover of fatty acids, both in delivery via your adipose sites, so that they're catching and releasing at a higher rate, and on top of that, there's a higher rate of synthesis and secretion of VLDL triglycerides, which are why there's a higher resulting LDL, that there almost certainly needs to be a higher relative lipolysis, which is that process by which adipose tissue is releasing the free fatty acids. Now, of course, there's a very long chain in which we can discuss the thyroid, and it can get very complicated. We have to start at the hypothalamus and all the other stuff. But I think just from one theorist to the other, speaking specifically about T3, I guess a way I would ask this is there a scenario in which you wouldn't need lower levels of T3, or let me put it this way, in which you wouldn't have resulting lower levels of T3 alongside higher levels of lipolysis? And I don't know of such a scenario. And if that's true, then how can we know whether it's the horse or the cart that we're looking at? Does that make sense?
Possibly. I'll start talking and then you'll tell me if I'm on the right track in terms of answering what I think you're asking. I think you're asking, is low T3 or low T3 signaling compatible with increased lipolysis? Is that?
I would say that it's almost certainly always the case. In fact, I don't know of a case in which you would have low T3 without there being some kind of disease state in which you don't have higher relative lipolysis.
Yeah, I mean, it will probably go together, as I say, because T3 is an anabolic signaling hormone. So, lipolysis is probably more regulated by insulin and probably the catecholamines, I would think. But yeah, I mean, as you say, we're both looking at the same data that, if you get very lean and you're drawing heavily on your adipose tissue and particularly if you're fasting or not eating very much, then you are seeing the same things. I think where we differ is A, in how concerned should we be about that state, and B, your hypothesis revolves around increased liver production of VLDL. And I've looked around the literature on sort of, fasting metabolism and low carb metabolism and those sorts of things for a long time, and everything that I see suggests that when you have a large amount of free fatty acid delivery to the liver, all those sort of enzymes that regulate the production of VLDL are down-regulated. The body doesn't want to produce VLDL when it's in a fasted state.
Oh, that's definitely new to me. So you're saying that higher free fatty acids being taken up from hepatocytes, the liver cells, would not drive higher VLDL production?
No, I think from what I've looked at, it generally in that scenario, they're beta oxidized, they're either pushed through the Krebs cycle or they're shunted to ketogenesis, and that's the main sort of disposal mechanism.
I would
In
be
many ways,
very
it wouldn't.
interested in any studies you can poke it. And
So,
this isn't me pushing back and saying that there aren't any. On the contrary, I think there's certainly a subtlety that I do draw toward, in that if you are not athletic and or thin especially, that there's certainly a greater shunting towards ketogenesis, the breakdown of fatty acids, because of course it makes a lot of sense. You need more of those ketones for the brain. They can cross the blood-brain barrier, et cetera. But in the case of this is part of why I posit that I think lean mass hyperresponders, we typically find they test with lower BHB levels. I suspect that eventually I have enough data, they'll also test with lower acetone levels, suggesting that they are actually in proportionality. They're proportionally breaking down and creating less ketones, and instead delivering more of those free fatty acids on board VLDLs. But all of that said, I don't actually know of any studies that show that the amount of free fatty acids coming to the liver are preferentially shunted towards the ketogenesis pathway, even at a 51% or more ratio. I think it's usually driving greater VLDL production. But like I said, I don't know. I haven't read every single study there is. I'd be very interested to know if there are.
Yeah, I mean, I can send you a few things that kind of point in that direction. It's slightly frustrating that we don't have just a proper tracer study in lean mass hyperresponders, because it would answer the question once and for all. You just need to
trying to get us there.
Because, yeah, I mean, certainly, I think part of the confusion will come from the fact that free fatty acid delivery to the liver is often studied in the context of metabolic unhealth.
Yes.
Yeah, sick populations, where you're particularly interested in fatty liver and, high amount of free fatty acid being delivered to the liver as a problem.
To add to that,
what is the liver going to do with it? And
right, and to add to that, we already have studies that show, for example, severely insulin-resistant hepatocytes will treat fatty acids, and for that matter, insulin, differently once they reach a certain pathological state. And so it's absolutely true. It's like a broader complaint that I have with medical science overall, is we should be spending over 50% of our efforts looking at healthy populations and then taking that data before instead we have like 90% of our data off of sick populations and then try to extrapolate from that on what we think is healthy. And I think it's backwards. But anyway, I'm sorry to continue with your point. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think there's probably many nuances about what happens to free fatty acids that are delivered to the liver. But in many ways, the idea that they're repackaged out into VLDLs, especially let's take the case of fasting or starvation, it really makes very little sense to me. It's essentially futile cycling. You're releasing energy, and then you're sort of spending energy, creating ApoBs and packaging these things up and, secreting them again in order to be broken down again. It doesn't make a great deal of sense. Sorry?
Can I give you the counter argument to that?
Go ahead.
Because the futile cycle, actually, that's a term that has been used before in papers that Siobhan and I have read. Because it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to people why it is that there'd be this release of energy that would then just come back to many of the same places. But when you think about it, systemically, it makes a whole lot of sense, because it reduces the amount of systemic effort to target particular tissues. So if certain tissues are in need, and this is why I like to use the buffet analogy. Think of a buffet, right? If you're running a diner where all the food is made to order, then you have to scale your wait staff up with the total number of tables you're servicing, right? Whereas conversely, if you're running a buffet, it's much easier to have a larger quantity of customers against a buffet, because you don't actually need to keep checking on the tables for whether or not they're getting the specific food that they want. You don't even have to check their desire. You can keep your eye on the actual buffet lines themselves, see how much the food is going up and down, right? Well, in a sense, what's happening, and it makes a lot of sense to me from a load balancing standpoint, I know it's a little bit more of a computer networking standpoint, is you're saying, look, we're just going to have one central command and control that's making sure that it continually repletes energy. And so as energy comes in, it makes sure it goes back out. But on top of that, it can make more informed decisions by just how much energy is coming in versus how much is going out. relative to other operational controls it has. So it does, obviously respond, the liver responds a lot to many different signals in the endocrine system. But as far as constantly repleting the adipose stores all around your body, it allows for greater global trafficking to get particular targeted tissues. Let me use kind of a simple example. Let's say that I've got, my forearm, and I'm flexing it a lot, and I'm using just a lot of muscle tissue there. And therefore, there's going to need to be more energy availability that comes to it at a certain point, especially as I kind of expend more of the energy that's available in tissues, not just from its own glycogen stores, but also from neighboring adipose tissue that may have free fatty acids. So I need other adipose tissue fatty acids made available to it. Well, while that's driving a lot of VLDL production, in spite of the fact that a lot of it's going to just get repleted and reesterified back into adipose tissue itself, a good portion of those are also still going to make it to those target tissues because it doesn't have to get targeted. There doesn't have to be special mechanisms in place because it's just being made bioavailable throughout the body. And that's I think, kind of the genius of the human body, is that it's really good about bringing up and down those buffet lines of, energy on demand. So anyway, that's kind of why I feel like it's exactly the opposite of a futile cycle. It's why you could like build up the muscle in your arm pretty easily, but it's kind of hard to build up the fat in your arm or reduce the fat in your arm specifically against, say, your other arm, is because that repletion cycle is constantly going on.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably say that you have enough free fatty acids probably circulating to provide the energy to whichever part of your body needs it. I mean, I see potentially your argument is that a VLDL particle can go directly to a locality of the body, and there where it is release a whole heap of free fatty acids. And I suppose there might be something to that, but as I say, I can send you a few papers, but certainly it does seem that the export of VLDL is really when the body is in a state of energy surplus, that those pathways appear to be upregulated.
It maybe, I mean, it depends on how much got released via lipolysis. That's why I think you could be really thin and be circulating more VLDLs. That gets back to the model, because you need more global trafficking to support the local tissue needs. And I've come to realize that it is hard to kind of get this across to a lot of different people, because it's sort of, for us on the engineering end, especially with networking, it's thinking about things in a little more of a distributed object sense. And really, I shouldn't even be saying energy, I should be saying energy potential. But it's in redistributing energy potential on a mass scale that has actually a relatively low level of effort on the part of the means of distribution, because of how it works with adipocytes. Adipocytes are a key ingredient to this whole schema, if you will, because they're kind of like the local food bank, if you will, to those tissues as necessary. But their constant repletion is a key component to how you distribute this and yet still make it locally available. Sorry, go ahead.
So you're actually saying, so what I was thinking is, let's take a state of fasting, because that's the most sort of clear-cut state. My characterization of your proposition was that the body is packaging up VLDLs to go to sites where they're needed, e.g. skeletal muscle, and release a whole package of fatty acids at that site to be used by the muscle tissue. But what you appear to be saying is that those VLDLs are repleting adipose tissue, even in a fasted state?
Yes. Not necessarily to the same degree, but at any given moment, I guarantee your non-esterified fatty acids that are getting packaged into VLDL, some proportion of them are going to target tissues, yes, that are non-adipose, but also lots of them are going back to adipose and getting reesterified there, depending on the level of demand. Now, it's fascinating, because there is still one other issue, which of course my own experiments help to expose to some degree, which is that there is, I guess you could call it a bunching up and spreading out effect, almost kind of an accordion effect, based on what you've been doing in, say, like a 2 or 3 day time span. So for example, when I do the protocol, there's a lot more bunching up that happens that if I continued the protocol will start to kind of spread out. And it appears to be, of course, the body's trying to find homeostasis with the amount of energy it wants to have in and out of the bloodstream based on these changing conditions. That's kind of understandable. And this is the same case with, say, fasting. For example, a lot of people will fast and they'll see their triglycerides go up, which may seem surprising to them, particularly given that they're, clearly in a state of energy deficit exogenously, right? Why endogenously would it be going up? But almost invariably, if somebody's been, doing this for, say, 7 days, their triglycerides are lower than when they started. And it seems to me that it's because the body's found that homeostasis, of course.
I mean, there's certainly going to be differences to a short-term effect, and then, as you say, as the body finds its homeostasis, which is probably why your Feldman protocol works so well, because it is very carefully calculated to a certain number of days. But I mean, the reason that sounds so strange to me, and again, I sort of look at things a lot from the hormonal standpoint, which is how the body regulates energy metabolism. My understanding is that when you need energy in the blood, lipolysis is an action, and you're not building up adipose tissue. Like, the two things are fairly mutually exclusive. And for, in the same way, if you're needing sugar into the bloodstream, your liver is releasing glycogen, breaking down glycogen and releasing it, and it's not sort of building up glycogen at the same time.
I think a good way.
That's my understanding.
I think a good way to describe it is it's not a state machine. It's not an either or. It
never will be, but it's because nothing is ever stopped. The body never stops things. But you definitely have a reciprocal, as one goes up, one goes down. And so it's interesting, because I hadn't twigged that was part of your hypothesis before, the fact that you believe that this VLDL is actually going back and sort of building up adipose at the same time as the adipose is releasing free fatty acids through lipolysis. So that sounds very curious to me, but it's interesting that
actually, you know what? While we're talking, because I'm going to ask you another question that you'll unpack, and then we'll bounce back to this one. I have a chart from a paper that I think is really kind of illustrative of this. But let's actually first discuss. This is the one question I want to ask for you. Is it possible for somebody who had never had any kind of hypothyroidism symptoms of any sort, who went on a very low carb diet, may have already been somewhat lean, see the phenotype of lean mass hyperresponder? Do you think it's possible through medication alone that you could erase the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype and basically take them back to the numbers that they had before?
If the underlying issue was that they had a subtle thyroid dysfunction?
Well, that's, of course, the reason I ask it this way is it's to see, did they induce it by going on a low carb diet? As in, it didn't exist there before, therefore it wasn't likely genetic. Is it possible that they induced it through the low carb diet? Like, that's one part of it. And the other part of it is, would changing that change, like, could they change that through medication and there would be no deleterious impact in making that change through medication?
So I think there's two scenarios which are probably quite important to distinguish. So I think there's some people who have a subtle underlying thyroid dysfunction, probably autoimmune, because most is. And if they go on a low carb diet, they will see their cholesterol go up. If they then replace their thyroid hormones adequately, will their cholesterol go back to normal? Potentially. The reason I hesitate is because the thyroid dysfunction was probably fairly subtle to begin with. And as I say, getting thyroid replacement spot on is a little bit tricky at the best of times. And so they may just not, exogenous hormones are never quite going to replace getting your own thyroid really working optimally. So they may or they may not. The other scenario is somebody who, so what we were discussing about at the beginning, people who have no particular autoimmune underlying thyroid dysfunction, but because they are very lean, probably under-eating, probably overtraining, they get this low T syndrome. And whether or not that's the main driver, or whether, as I say, lack of insulin signaling, lack of IGF-1 signaling, lack of leptin signaling, whether those are more the main players, we don't know. But let's say that their cholesterol then goes high. Question is, if you give them a lot of T3 will their cholesterol go down? I mean, it's a slightly risky thing to do. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that people do these experiments, but I mean, there's certainly one, you know, if you've read my document on Dropbox, there's somebody who submitted something to Paul Jaminet's blog, who did exactly that, who gave himself T3 and saw his cholesterol come down quite a lot. Now, I wouldn't recommend that people emulate that.
Right.
But yeah,
And again, this isn't
not advisable.
And this wouldn't necessarily counter the model, of course, because again, if it does turn out that I'm right, and that the reason for the higher LDL is really that further upstream, there's actually less lipolysis turnover, then I think that that's a factor. So real quick, I'm gonna go ahead.
So if I could just finish that point, if the issue is that you've got low T3 because you're under eating, overtraining, you've got too lean, then you need to address that issue, not just taking a bunch of T3. So there's a member of the Facebook group who you know, has mentioned that she suffered from eating disorders in the past, and she got down very lean to a level of body fat that she realized was unhealthy. And at that time, her she was doing 1 meal a day, and her cholesterol, her LDL went up to 800, which is phenomenally high. And then when she realized that she was at an unhealthy weight, and she decided to consciously make an effort to put on some weight to come back to a healthier weight, she didn't even change her diet very much. I understand that she went from OMAD to 2MAD. She had 1 meal carnivore, 1 meal keto, so not really changing macronutrients that much. But by making a conscious effort to eat more food, to gain some weight, to come back to a healthy weight where she felt stronger, that was enough to bring her cholesterol right down from sort of LDL of 800 to an LDL of around 140. So that really epitomizes, I think, the fact that if your problem is that you are under eating, overtraining, and too lean, then the solution to that is not to start taking T3. The solution to that is to start eating more and getting to a healthy weight.
So a couple things for the viewer, if you didn't already know what we're saying by OMAD, that's 1 meal a day. 2MAD is 2 meal a day. To be fair, the person who I think you're talking about, they have since actually submitted one more cholesterol test just recently, and their cholesterol has been back up again. So we'll have
not up to 800.
Of course not, right? And that's and so. But again, this exemplifies the model somewhat in that if you're, whether or not it turns out that it's too much calorie restriction or not, that was the leanest she had ever been.
Right. So it validates your model and it validates mine, but obviously
exactly
for different
right.
reasons.
So in that
but my main concern there is if she, you know, and I've seen this happen on the Facebook group. If people go onto the Facebook group and say, you know, I've got these sky high cholesterol numbers, my trig's really low, and my HDL's really high, and everybody goes, yeah, that's brilliant, well done, you're going to live forever, and nobody highlights that there can be, as you've pointed out, good reasons and bad reasons for your cholesterol being high.
right.
You know, and one of the bad reasons that I really think we need to be talking about more is the fact that your hormones may be out of whack because you're not eating enough, you're too lean. And I don't know if you remember, I did a quick survey in the Facebook group at one point, asking women how their menstrual cycles had changed since they'd become a lean mass hyperresponder. And it was roughly 1/3 of women had seen their menstrual cycles either stop or become very irregular. And that's a real concern, and it's something which I really feel strongly about.
I'm actually curious on that one. How many people responded overall?
I'd have to look at the numbers. Probably about 80 people overall, but that, I mean, that's really off the top of my head. I can look.
I would be I'm very interested in. If there were, so what, roughly 25 to 30, you're saying would have,
I mean,
lost
I can
their
look
menstrual
it up
cycle?
quickly. It probably won't take me long if you're interested.
Because I will say this up front, like as far as whatever diet you're on, if you're a female and you observe that your menstrual cycle has disappeared, I'd consider that very concerning. Whatever the situation.
Yeah, it's a red flag, and you know, I think that's why I do, you know, I'm probably getting off on a tangent here when perhaps you wanted to go in another direction, but I do feel very, very strongly about it, because I do think that is something that is just not talked about enough. And obviously we tend to all be focused about, you know, fatty liver and obesity and diabetes and, you know, that end of the spectrum. And I think we can lose sight of the fact that, you know, there is definitely a concern at the other end of the spectrum. You can be too lean, you know, you can be too low calorie, particularly. Okay, I've got the survey up. No, it's not as many as I said. We've got 20 saying periods haven't changed. We've got 16 saying periods have stopped or become very infrequent, less than 1 every 3 months. And then 6 people saying they were infrequent and have now become more regular. Oh, and sort of there's an extra person who said they're more infrequent, but presumably not less than 1 every 3 months. So not the biggest sample, but, you know,
yeah,
significant.
Well, for what it's worth, I mean, as with the xanthomas, it's something that if it's a measure of concern, it's something I would, and so I may actually boost yours. I may actually set up my own and see if I can get a lot more people that would chime in, because I'd like a good sample. The one downside, and this is really with any Facebook group, is that thing that you're putting in front of them is going to have potential self-selection bias. That's a subject that they're interested in, so that's something that they're going to chime in on, right? The other problem is you want to, as best as you can't really pull this off very easily, is try to keep somebody from having an opinion by the way that you state it, so that they're really answering honestly and not in a way that they think would be, you know, looked at favorably in the group. One downside with a lot of these Facebook polls that kind of sucks is that it identifies you in the poll. But I think maybe there's a setting you can do to change that. Anyway, I'll look into that. But I'm definitely interested in that. But to your point, I certainly think that you can be too lean. I certainly think that there are signs that you are too lean. I think that's one of the signs. Certainly there are many other things that can appear, and particularly in the blood work, which is why I love blood work so much. But it's, again, something that I think is worth keeping a close eye on. Okay, so I found the chart, which I'm going to share the screen now. And I give some credit to, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting his name right now, but he's the one who turned me on to this study. But this is from Fatty Acid Metabolism and Adipose Tissue, Muscle, and Liver in Health and Disease. And I have some graphics that are overlaid that are my graphics. But basically what this was, you know, actually, let me even see if I can, hopefully I don't lose the stream if I do this. No, I'm afraid to do it. I was going to go into presentation mode because then it would clear this away. But pretend my overlaid graphics aren't here. Basically what we're seeing here is in this table, you're seeing what the input is. And then you're seeing in these columns, adipose tissue, skeletal muscle, and liver. And in adipose tissue, they're tracking, and I believe this was a tracer study in which they observed that lipoprotein-based triglycerides are repleting the adipose tissue at around 45 grams a day. Whereas non-esterified fatty acids, they're getting about 5 grams a day. This is in adipose tissue, right? So
that's presumably including chylomicrons?
Correct, lipoprotein-based triglyceride. So any triglyceride coming from a lipoprotein.
Yeah.
Whereas conversely, with skeletal muscle, at rest, the non-esterified fatty acids, which of course are going to be predominantly released via adipose tissue, around 20 grams per day. Whereas triglycerides coming off of lipoproteins are going to be around 10 grams a day, so about a third of their energy provided from fatty acids are going to be from lipoproteins. Now, what I'm positing is that, and you know what, I think I even have this on another graph, I do, that you can almost think of this as global distribution versus local distribution. I have a whole animation there, but I think, yeah. So for example, VLDL is like the global distributor, and much of its distribution is going to be at adipose tissue, which is good because it's the local distributor. It's connecting these non-esterified fatty acids, especially to nearby or adjacent cells, but not entirely, but a very large amount of nearby cells are going to be getting their non-esterified fatty acids from nearby adipose tissue. And to some degree, they're going to transmigrate into adipocytes where they'll get reesterified and then re-released again, right? And it's understandable why, from a distance, if you're not thinking about it as a redistribution, as an energy redistribution scheme, it could look totally futile. Like it could just look like a big mess of stuff going out, getting redeposited, going back out again. It just looks like a lot of effort for no particularly good reason, right? But because that scheme is set up the way that it is, there doesn't have to be a more complex process in how it can shuttle energy to the correct target tissues. And this again brings it back to the buffet analogy, because in the buffet analogy, there could be a few tables that are really hungry and the rest of the tables are pretty full. They don't really even need anything. And it's okay, because you don't need to know where those tables are. You just need to be sure you keep stocking that buffet. As long as you keep stocking that buffet line, then those really hungry tables will take care of themselves. That's up to them. They determine what their affinity is, and to bring it back to cells, what level they're going to express the receptors and act upon taking up more of their energy. Whereas, again, the adipocytes you can almost think of as part of the trays in that very long buffet line, if that makes sense. Am I articulating this pretty well?
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand your point. I think what I would say is, so that chart that you put up about where different places get their fuels from, it seems about right, especially for, somebody who's having 3 square meals a day. And again, the distribution network makes sense in that context, because you want to store food for meals and release it after meals. So yes, your adipocytes are going to take up all of the, your chylomicron, fatty acids from there. And then in between meals, they're going to release them. But to me, it seems pretty clear that that's, that is a regulation where as one goes up, one goes down. It shows in your table that sort of, uptake into, lipolysis is increased by fasting. I can't remember the exact, things, but I think it had adipocytes, repleted during the fed state. And, so to me, it's a system that works very well. It's a storage system and a release system. But when the body needs energy, when the skeletal muscles need energy, typically the body's response is melt down your assets. So lipolysis happens, you get a bloodstream full of free fatty acids, you get glucose pumped in the bloodstream. This is what happens when you do intense exercise, right?
Yeah.
But that's the buffet. The buffet is your free fatty acids. That's what skeletal muscle is taking up, as well as glucose, as well as ketones, depending on what state you're in. But the idea that adipocytes are being replenished at a time when you're fasting, that to me doesn't make any sense. And it runs counter to what I've seen generally in terms of the regulation of these things.
Yeah, again, and just with extra emphasis, I do believe that proportionality shifts more towards non-adipocytes. But do I think that they're repleting adipocytes as well? Yes, I do. It's just that there's affinity differentials, right? And so
given that nothing goes to zero, I wouldn't like to say that they're definitely not, like there's definitely no uptake in adipocytes. There will be, but it's going to be very, very minuscule.
And again, if you
we're not going to prove it either way until we get
until we have our tracer study with lean mass hyperresponders, which for what it's worth, I think I may be privy to some information that there might be something in the works on that. We'll see. But regardless, it's absolutely true. Until we can actually see this turnover in action, and I mean turnover with the VLDLs, turnover with the adipocytes specifically, and I mean, it's super hard to do, but if we could actually see in vivo the triglyceride secretion rate, how much triglycerides on board these VLDLs are getting secreted, because it's the one place where a lot of people disagree with me, including inside the low carb world, is they can't conceive of the idea that there's so much faster turnover, which for me, all the evidence is pointing to that. I mean, one of my favorite ones came from Volek and Finney, which is that they show a lot of these fat-adapted athletes have higher free glycerol levels in their blood, which to me shows greater deesterification that's happening at a higher rate with these triglycerides. Their glycerol backbone is coming free. So anyway,
that wouldn't be different under either sort of hypothesis, because both of us are saying there's a large amount of lipolysis going on, which would result in.
But let me do this. I'm going to take you over to a study, which I think is kind of relevant, which comes back to hypothyroidism, and I think may help to get us to a divide of sorts, or a greater distinction. So naturally, I was very interested myself. I checked out, I was trying to look for reviews. So for example, effects of thyroid dysfunction on lipid profile was a pretty decent one, 2011 it looks like. And in here it says, so thyroid function regulates a wide variety of metabolic parameters. Thyroid function significantly affects lipoprotein metabolism as well as some cardiovascular disease risk factors, thus influencing overall CDV risk. Indeed, even with normal range of thyroid stimulating hormone values, a linear increase in total cholesterol, low density lipoprotein cholesterol, and triglycerides, and a linear decrease in high density lipoprotein cholesterol levels has been observed with increasing TSH. And actually, this is again getting back to the problem with looking at sick populations versus healthy ones. Of the ones I've been able to find to this point that do detail the full lipid panel, hypothyroidism in a pathological state was usually coupled with lower HDL and higher triglycerides, which wouldn't surprise me too much if indeed it's pathological to the extent that it's activating more lipolysis than the body is turning over. And therefore you end up with more residence time for the triglycerides and these triglyceride-rich lipoproteins. Does that make sense?
So yeah, so the first point I'd make is that under the thyroid hypothesis, if you like, the cause of high LDL in the blood is a downregulation of liver receptors, you know, particularly for LDL, potentially other cells as well, because if cells aren't multiplying, they're not dividing, they don't need as much cholesterol, and so there'll be less cellular cholesterol uptake. So that's just sort of the context that I'm thinking about it in. On the point about sort of what happens to triglycerides and HDL in hypothyroidism, yeah, the literature is quite mixed. Some studies with HDL, some studies show an elevation, some show a decrease, some show it's about the same. I can certainly say with my husband, he had high HDL, it was 1.9, 2 point something, 1.8, that it was definitely high. I suspect that there is an interaction here again with the fact that these people are on a low carb diet that seems to make the HDL go to the higher side, and the triglycerides. And again, my husband's triglycerides were low. I'll give you his triglycerides. So trigs
that is
0.
kind of an important clue to try to differentiate. I mean, it's
so it could well be, but I don't think so. My husband's trigs were 50 in your terms when he was when his LDL was at its highest. So so pretty low. I think, just based on what I've seen in my husband and others, I suspect that there is an interaction there whereby if you're low carb and slightly hypothyroid, your trigs are fairly low and your HDL is fairly likely to be high. However, you're right, there could be. So obviously we get a lot of people in the lean mass hyperresponder group who say, everything's great except my trigs are too high. And it could well be that for some of them, it is a case that their thyroid isn't doing what it should, and then that could be a clue that their trigs are too high. But yeah,
you know about our high trig page,
checklist,
right? Like we about
cut out the coffee.
Yeah, well, I want to say about 50 to 60% of the time it's an unfasted test. You've probably seen it a million times coming into the group where somebody's like, I don't understand, my trigs are like 250, and it's like, well, was it fasted? No, I was visiting the doctor, he said, well, just do the test right here. And, well, did you eat? Oh yeah, 3 hours earlier I had a whole bunch of bacon and eggs with lots of butter. It's like, okay, well, you installed those triglycerides into chylomicrons into your bloodstream, right? And then, of course, yes, there's the coffee sensitivity, which was kind of exciting when we were coming into that discovery last year. That unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, I should emphasize, we don't know we don't know yet whether or not it's actually problematic, but there seems to be some people, especially on very low carb, especially like carnivore, who will find that coffee brings up their triglycerides. And usually it's a more nominal amount. It's not usually in, say, the 250, 300 range. It's more like, I don't know, like 150, 200 or something like that. But who, it turns out, if they remove coffee, then their trigs end up looking a lot more like a typical lean mass hyperresponder. But there is a small fraction of some people who would look a little bit more like a lean mass hyperresponder if their trigs could come down and they seem to have a problem bringing it. It's just, it tends to be a pretty small amount. Usually if your HDL is high, your trigs are low. And
Yeah.
typically this kind of comes back to the model. It's because we believe there's more catabolism of VLDLs as to the reason why your HDL is higher. So when somebody's HDL is high and their trigs are high, we assume it's one of those two, the non-fasted test or the coffee. If their trigs are high and their HDL is low, usually I feel like there's more to it. They may have more carb creep, or they may be having a lot of, liquid or refined forms of fat. So they feel like they can consume as much fat as they want, and it's not really going to turn out to be the case for many of them. So that's the challenge, is trying to isolate down exactly what the root cause of that is. But most people end up finding the group, and again, this is a self-selection issue, but most people end up finding the group really already were kind of close to those cut points. We try to keep an eye out for anybody who has very wonky, completely different levels that are otherwise fitting the visual description, the lifestyle description we're used to seeing with lean mass hyperresponders. But that's part of why I kind of may have this, and maybe misplaced confidence, that if I could go down the road to a gym full of people who are lean and athletic and put them on the diet I control, which of course would be typically very carnivore, I really do think probably 75 to 80% of them would be borderline to fully lean mass hyperresponders. But don't know for sure, not until I get the funding to run that kind of an experiment.
So as you say, trigs and HDL tend to move together. Obviously, there can be many exceptions to that. And my understanding of that is basically if you have a lot of triglyceride on VLDLs hanging out in the bloodstream, sort of HDL basically kind of steps in to try and start passing that triglyceride off to elsewhere, and sort of, I'm probably paraphrasing this ghastly here because your lipid metabolism knowledge is better than mine, but sort of HDL kind of get used up in the process, and so you end up with, if you've got a lot of trigs hanging around for too long, you tend to get low HDL. And the reason why I think that in the hypothyroid condition it may be different on low carb to non-low carb is, under my understanding, in a low carb diet you're going to have very little VLDL. So provided you're at a stage, sort of, if you've been fasted long enough, your liver production of VLDL is going to be pretty low, and therefore your body isn't going to need to clear so much triglyceride out of the blood. So the fact that the thyroid function may impact on lipoprotein lipase, which is one of the hormones that does that, is going to be less important, and so you may still end up with quite low triglycerides. And subsequently the HDL moves in concert. On a high carb diet, obviously, if you got overloaded carbs going to your liver upregulates VLDL production, de novo lipogenesis, you end up with a lot more VLDL sort of in your system. And so maybe you end up with a higher burden of triglycerides that you need to clear.
I think in both those contexts, it really depends on how metabolically healthy you are.
It will.
And how much you are or are not in energy surplus. So
exactly.
So the bottom line is, you may be, I think somebody who's a high carber but they're very athletic probably isn't secreting that many VLDLs, because generally speaking, they're not maxing out their glycogen stores to, the extent that it's going to create more de novo lipogenesis, right? But getting back to what you were just saying before, I think probably the real easy Cliff's Notes to why I think the HDL and triglycerides kind of counterbalance each other. First of all, it's almost invariably in a metabolically healthy context where they will tend to be more, let's say, responsive. Their levels will be very responsive to like changes in the diet. Those people are a little bit further down the road of metabolic dysregulation. Their lipid levels, in my opinion, of what I've seen thus far, their lipid levels are less mutable by diet, because I think that they are in much more of a pathological state that's impacting their lipid levels more than what their diet does, relatively speaking. Again, that's also analog, right? But the key is, if you're metabolically healthy, then how much you are reliant on those fatty acids as part of your trafficking system is going to impact the VLDL secretion and then potentially the downstream level of LDL, assuming, again, you're not in energy surplus, which I think kind of jives with what you may be speculating as well. The only thing that we're both pontificating is at what point are any number of the people who are in the lean mass hyperresponder group in a bad way for either being, for under eating or for any other things that might have a pathological outcome. In which case, I'm interested in any way that we can help to identify that. You mentioned earlier, for example, losing of your cycle. Obviously, we also look for things like chronic inflammation. But if there is something that can be gleaned from, thyroid levels, that would be of interest to me, although I don't know about the low T3. Now, you have been inquiring on some other markers that you think might help further gain information on this. Did you have any other markers you wanted to share that were of interest to you?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of markers that are of quite significant interest to me are tricky because they're expensive to measure. So a couple of things I'm particularly interested in is leptin and IGF-1, both of which are quite expensive.
The
person
every time.
Yeah, great.
You might be interested in my data, by the way.
I would be very interested in your data.
I ran IG. You know what? I may even have that ready for you, because I think in preparation for this, I did. I actually generated my own graph, and I'm going to it as we speak. Yep, there we go. Now, your prediction would be that my LDL-C would correlate with my IGF-1 given the graph you have here, right? Let me see if I can.
Yeah, that's the general prediction. IGF-1 is quite a tricky thing for another reason, which is that it has 6 different binding proteins that can all affect its sort of actual effect in the body. So you've got IGF binding protein 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. There might be more, but I'm aware of 6. So I have seen some studies where I think some of the binding proteins correlate better, but yeah, this is, and this sort of correlates with kind of the general theory of, are we seeing a lack of anabolic signaling in some way? So that would make sense if sort of the lack of cholesterol uptake into cells leaves more in the bloodstream, and that would correlate.
Boy, are you in luck. I have, I believe, 79 IGF-1s to match my cholesterol levels, because I'm an obsessive, blood draw guy. And this, by the way, goes over several different types of experiments. In fact, I think I also have the weight gain, weight loss experiment as part of it. So are you ready? We're about to scroll down to it.
I'm ready.
This is my IGF-1 versus LDL-C. This is just in a graph, one into the other. And this is in a scatter plot, which, no question, it doesn't correlate.
Not much from there, is there?
Yeah, it was interesting to peek at. For what it's worth, I believe it's this one. For what it's worth, I think the highest that I'd ever had my IGF-1, yeah, 271, or maybe it was the 241, it might be the 241, was when I was doing the white bread and processed meat experiment. I spiked my IGF-1 like crazy at one of the midpoint tests. Maybe the latest test that I had taken, not completing the 7 days, but the one that I had access to a LabCorp and then had it taken. So the one in which I had had the most white bread relative to the other tests. And that, I will concede, that did kind of surprise me a little bit. I wasn't expecting it to be so high, but it was somewhere in the I think it was this 241. That's what I'm going to guess. But yeah, I don't seem to have a lot of correlation between LDL-C and IGF-1. But I will say that you had me wondering about getting other thyroid tests, and I have added, I don't know if I'm going to have this for every test, but I'm going to try to occasionally get reverse T3. I know we've been able to skip over it up until this point, but for the general audience, again, there's a big hierarchy, if you will, of like a waterfall effect of going from the hypothalamus all the way down to what results in, T4 is, you could kind of say, a precursor to T3, but technically 2 flavors of T3. One is active T3, one is reverse T3, and I think you already know this, but it's kind of fascinating. I believe T4 has 4 different links to iodine. It's either iodide or it's iodine. That's why iodine is so important for thyroid function. And what happens is, I believe T4 gets converted to either T3, which cleaves off one of those, and that's why it's T3. It's 3 of those bonds. And reverse T3 is just, it's also cleaving off one of those bonds, but it's a different bond. And this T3 is active and actually acts. And the reverse T3 is inactive. It's an inactive protein. So that's what's cool about chemistry, is you're just kind of like, oh, well, I'm actually going to change this to where basically this will have no effect, and all I do is just, cleave this other bond. So it's really fascinating stuff. But reverse T3 is good in that you're seeing now both forms of the outcome. You're seeing both sides of the ledger, if you will. Did I say that right? Or do you want to correct me on any of that?
No, I mean that's basically reverse T3 sort of antagonizes T3 function, and will often be upregulated when T3 is downregulated, although not always. And there's definitely some nuances there that I have not quite figured out yet. I mean, there's many nuances to thyroid metabolism. So yeah, I mean, reverse T3 is definitely, again, expensive and rather labile during the day, I believe, which can make it a bit tricky. So you might just want to check how much sort of variation there is on it, just in general. But probably the ones that I'd be more interested in is just total T3, which probably moves more, and then free T3, which probably moves less. And then I think the other thing that's important to remember about thyroid metabolism is that there are, circulating levels of these hormones, but then there's also quite a bit of, so that conversion from T4 to T3 happens often in peripheral tissues. So you have sort of within the cells that T4 can get converted to T3 to have a specific effect in the cells. And
local control.
Local control.
Yeah.
And it's entirely possible that the effect of T3, particularly in states, particularly in some of the more interesting states that we might consider, may be quite different in different tissues. So for example, you've got T3 and brown adipose tissue, and the conversion to T3 and brown adipose tissue is stimulated by cold, as it would be, because you want your brown adipose tissue to burn lots of energy and make lots of heat. And then you're going to have a different sort of action of T3 in skeletal tissue and in liver tissue. And the liver appears to be mostly responsible for the plasma levels of T3, which is what makes the liver such an interesting, the liver's interesting anyway, but that what makes the liver so interesting particularly when we're considering these states of low T3, such as fasting or a ketogenic diet.
But that would, again, be kind of with my expectation. I mean, it really is sort of the central server, if you will, for the energy metabolism, and necessarily so. It has to work with all this apportionment data. But thank you so much. Did you have any additional thoughts that you wanted to share?
Yeah, so just in terms of the other things that I watch, I have particular interest in mean corpuscular volume, MCV. So this is another thing that we tend to see mildly elevated in most lean mass hyperresponders. And when I say mildly elevated, that's probably not out of the lab's normal range, but definitely in the 90s for most people, some people over 100. And that's quite curious to me, because,
now, is that in a CMP, a complete blood count, or comprehensive metabolic panel?
That would be a CBC, you call it, a complete blood count.
Yes.
So I have a particular interest in that, and I wonder, so, we have to look quite carefully for these downstream effects, because that's what we're really interested in. And even with low T3 syndrome in general, there's a question mark over whether there is tissue hypothyroidism. Probably most people agree that there is, but again, there may be tissue hypothyroidism in some tissues and not others. And so it is interesting to see what can we glean from the other markers that we're seeing. And so cholesterol is one. MCV, I think, is another. Potentially things like, again, not necessarily linked to T3, but potentially that leptin, insulin, IGF-1, general anabolic signaling. But as I say, red blood cells seem to decrease. So there's
blood cells, not white blood cells.
Yeah, white blood cells seems to decrease as well, but I don't know. I haven't really bothered looking into that as much as the red blood cells. So I don't know, I mean, yeah, it makes sense if you've got, the other thing is RDW tends to increase slightly, not universally, but that does seem to be the case. And again, when you look
That's
into
red cell
RDW,
distribution width, I believe,
that's the one,
right?
yeah.
You said it tends to increase slightly.
Tends to increase slightly.
Interesting.
And there can be many reasons for that. So again, not a specific marker, but again, interesting because red cell distribution width tends to increase when you have red blood cells in the blood hanging around a long time. And that seems to be fairly universally seen in a state where the body is, if I can say, trying to economize, trying to do more with less, trying to keep things hanging around for a bit longer so I don't have to make so many more of them. And so that, that's an interesting marker to me as
So
well.
I can tell you like a stock challenge I would have to anybody, both, in my corner of a hypothesis or outside, is virtually any study that I look at. The very first thing I'm wondering is, are they looking at a selection that's in a pathological state or not? Are they looking at a sick population, right? Are they finding a marker that tends to be part of the cart that follows the horse of bad things, right? So a good example is one of the things that you had a link on was that low T3 can associate with higher oxidative stress. And that would make perfect sense to me in regards to, we know part of the potential immune response along with oxidative stress is greater cytokine signaling, which can result in higher VLDL production. And can, and that's another reason why you could have higher, for example, LDL for a bad reason. But typically that also correlates with the higher triglycerides, the lower HDL, right? And so, and this is why, like, I want to see where we can see that temporally this came first, now the bad stuff comes after, as opposed to we're seeing this correlation of these things that could be responsive or as a result of the bad stuff. And that's kind of the challenge. That's part of the challenge with a lot of the reference ranges. A lot of the reference ranges have lots of assumptions built in that regard.
Yeah, it certainly is. I think when we're talking about, say, RDW, for example, there's a huge amount of literature out there that basically shows that the lower your RDW is, the longer you live, the healthier you are. I know you've worked a bit with Dr. Tommy Wood, and he's, quite, knows these sorts of things very well. So I think, yeah, markers can mean different things in different scenarios, that's for sure. But I think there is this tendency in the low carb world to say, oh, well, this marker that means something for all of the rest of the population, it doesn't mean anything for us because we're in a different context. And that might be true. We can't say that it definitely isn't until we've actually done long-term studies on low carbers. But I think it's very important not to jump to that conclusion, because you could be sort of missing certain things on the way. Likewise with low leptin. So the lady that we were speaking about earlier who was sort of underweight, her leptin level was rock bottom. It was below the reference range even for people with a BMI of 12. Which I thought was really, really interesting. And one of the question marks that I've sort of had is whether people who have previously been obese, which is going to be a lot of the people who found a low carb way of eating, are people who have previously been overweight or obese, have lost a lot of weight. And those people are going to have a lot of relatively empty fat cells and potentially be relatively leptin deficient. And then leptin release seems to be, again, lower on low carb diets. And we know that leptin is responsible for some of these hormonal changes that we see when people are under eating or starving. And so is there a factor there that people who were previously very overweight have lost a lot of weight? They become more vulnerable to seeing these effects because they're relatively leptin deficient.
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because leptin is actually now a big part of the paper that we're writing on the energy model. So there's a particularly influential paper that I read while I was doing filming the documentary, and it had a lot of amazing stuff that connected the dots on a more systemic level as to, and granted, it was a rodent model that they were using, but they were in fact fasting these rodents, and they were seeing that indeed, once glycogen stores got low enough in the liver, and this has been something I've been positing for years, but I didn't know exactly what the pathways might even be, but that at some level, when glycogen stores get low enough with the liver, that it would result in greater trafficking of fatty acids, because systemically it makes a lot of sense. You know that buffering of the short-term energy supply is now threatened, and you have reason to put more, you know, it's the buffet thing, right? You know that there's less
energy.
yeah,
Need
there's
energy.
less
It's got to come from someone.
glucose to load into the buffet for the on-demand in case the saber-toothed tiger comes around the corner. So what do? You want to replace it with more fatty acids, right? So what's the triggering mechanism? And I've long suspected it's hepatic glucose stores, which gets back to, gosh, I want to say it was 2017, my original energy status experiment. There's even a big blog post and a presentation I did on and so forth. But again, couldn't elucidate what the mechanisms were. What they did was they found out with these mice that if you got glycogen stores low enough to where it inhibited glycogenolysis, so there was less that was being supplied, what would happen is that would result in hypoleptinemia. And hypoleptinemia further activated the HPA axis, which further resulted in greater lipolysis. In which case, it makes a lot of sense from the energy model standpoint, is that's the dots that need to be connected to bring it back around to why there would be relatively higher levels of lipolysis that's driving this greater amount of fat trafficking throughout that whole process. And I think that's why, like, this is yet one more thing where I would say, okay, we should make a distinction. Low leptin could be good or bad. What we want to know is it leptin is insufficiency, right? You use the word deficiency, for example, right? Is deficiency suggests that it's pathological, right? That it's going to be problematic in some fashion, that you would rather have more than not, right? But we don't know that. We don't know that in either direction. We don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, again, you'd look at the downstream effects, isn't it? And so that's one of my posits, is that maybe leptin is one of the controlling factors that may be downregulating people's sex hormones so that they're not seeing their menstrual cycle, you know, in the same way that they used to. That's downregulating sort of anabolic signaling. You know, that's sort of behind a lot of this.
That's testable.
And
like I now speculate that if we tested a whole bunch of lean mass hyperresponders, they would have lower levels of leptin. Possibly at the bottom of a range, maybe the low range. But will that likewise coincide, as you were mentioning, with, for example, females losing their cycle? I'm very interested. I would like to see that. I do think that there's clearly a threshold. The example who you brought up is obviously an example that's kind of a bit more on the power curve of the other end. That's more an outlier than the norm. But I would be very interested in those people who, you know, for example, those women who've not lost their cycle. What are their leptin levels? And, you know, do they show any other signs, negative signs that we can look to?
Exactly. So, I mean, one of the things that, you know, I would love for you to be, I know you're doing a lot of testing on lean mass hyperresponders, and, you know, there's definitely a whole bunch of stuff that I would love to see tested, including leptin, including all the hormones, including IGF-1, you know, including the T3 and the free T3 and the reverse T3, including DEXA scans for bone density, you know.
Yeah, can we talk about that for a second? Because you brought that up in your pontifications. You were explaining, for example, that is it that low T3 can be associated with lower bone density, right?
Probably in some study somewhere. I mean, it wouldn't be surprising. But if the low T3 is due to a state of undereating, I mean, there's a huge amount of on the female athlete triad, relative energy deficiency in sport, you know, and not everybody might get to the point where their bone density is low, and it's something that's probably going to take, you know, a long time to manifest in and of itself. But it's definitely something we should be concerned about, because it, you know, if my concern is coming from the point of view is, you know, ketosis and catabolic states, you know, great in the short term. If you're in it for years and years, or are you missing out on something? And again, things like IGF-1, there's a U-curve with all-cause mortality, with cardiovascular disease. You know, so you don't want it too low. You need some anabolic signaling, you need some insulin signaling to grow your brain cells. to grow your bones, so, for all of these things. And so,
Again,
yeah.
I'd almost want to say insufficient anabolic signaling, right? Like the question is your body achieving the goals that you would mean for it to be able to achieve under normal, circumstances? For example, if you're trying to build muscle, of course, you want sufficient anabolic signaling. And if whatever diet or circumstance you're dealing with, you're inhibiting that from reaching a goal level that you would expect, and it's really causing problems for you, then yeah, then now we have a pathological state. So it's true. That's absolutely something that's key. I will say this. I do feel pretty confident because I do know a lot of lean mass hypertension. You probably do now as well. DEXA scans are a pretty low-hanging fruit. They're not like reverse T3. Lots of people get DEXA scans all the time. I would have thought if there was reduction in bone density, that would have popped up on our radar by now, just because that is one of the things that they look to. In fact, it's one of the things usually the DEXA scan people like to point out is a special benefit that you get from doing a DEXA scan in particular, because it's a big indicator of health. Your bone density is a big factor as to how well you're doing, especially with nutrient sufficiency.
I mean, it's definitely something that I'd love to see some data on. As I say, it will be a relatively slow-moving thing, so you'd ideally want to study people who've been lean mass hypertensive for many years. But yeah, I know you're doing some studies, and I would love to see that data. I think it is just worth sort of pointing out that when you're in a state of relative energy deficiency, you can feel pretty good in the short term sometimes. And sometimes you'll feel great for a while and then you'll hit a bit of a wall. And sometimes you might think that you're feeling great for ages, but actually you're not perhaps supporting, the underlying kind of long-term building projects of your body that you need to be. And again, Dr. Tommy would be really familiar with this because there's a huge amount of literature out there on the phenomenon of relative energy deficiency in sports. And it's really common that people don't realize that they're in that state.
He has a talk
But
on
nonetheless,
that
it
I
can
think
be
you
happening.
even linked to, right? RED, relative energy deficiency, because
Yeah, so it used to be called the female athlete triad, and they changed the name because A, it's not a triad, and B, it's not unique to females. But there's a huge amount of literature out there on it.
yeah, that's
So
great.
it's, I think, again, it's something I think people need to know about. If you're a professional athlete and you've got a coach, they're going to be watching you. They're going to be making sure you're eating enough calories. If you're an amateur athlete, if you're someone that just goes really hard in the gym, and you have one meal a day and that's a carnivore meal, you're probably not getting enough calories. It's an incredibly satiating diet, and many athletes who are just eating real foods really struggle to get enough calories in because it's hard to even eat that much sweet potato.
Well,
So
it's not just that. We talked a little bit earlier about leptin. What is leptin? It's a hormone that's letting you know that you don't need more food, right? So it's there's in fact there's risk with some people far down the road of having, say, leptin resistance, which is something that's also getting closely studied right now. But exactly what you're talking about, if you can get, I know a lot of lean mass hyperresponders who can easily achieve one meal a day, and it may not be in their best interest, depending on what their circumstances are. And so I think that is something that's worth looking to. I think one thing that I really want to laud you for, and that I want to emphasize, is that I even mentioned this all the way back on Peter Attia's podcast. It may well be that the lean mass hyperresponder study, or just lean mass hyperresponders in general, are not at risk for cardiovascular disease to the degree that we would have thought, or even at all, right? And our study that I'm doing with Tommy Wood and Spencer Nadolski hopefully will help us elucidate that. But as I said then on that podcast, as I'm saying to you now, that doesn't mean that there may not be a problem with the phenotype that we do want to be looking for. We want to be looking for any and all possible things. There's nothing wrong with gaining more information that we can then share amongst each other to see if we can figure that out. Now, thus far, of course, I'm going to be a skeptic to you, just as I am a skeptic to myself and anybody else who wants to look at it in the best light. Let's get as strong a data as we can. It's the one benefit of having the group, having the Facebook group. I've been so appreciative that there's so much free data sharing amongst each other. And again, I have to tell you, I'm so proud of the group for being very data centric. Relative to other Facebook groups, I think we're just so sciencey, and I've really appreciated that because it allows for this kind of exploration into ideas without feeling like a lot of the rah-rah bias, can overshadow it, or that people are being discouraged from sharing information they may, that may not be tailored to the majority narrative and so forth. So once again, I appreciate your doing further work in this regard. And as always, I feel like part of being a good scientific community is to really showcase those people that might have opinions very different than everybody else. Certainly, I can identify with that.
I mean, the Facebook group really is, I would say, quite unique among Facebook groups in that, it is the only place where people really, I mean, we have our moments on there, but, there is a diversity of opinions. There are a lot of people on there who are very intelligent, very science-minded, and spend their lives like me on PubMed, and it really does make for an interesting experience. And like you say, there are a lot of ideas being thrown around, and I'm really pleased about that. And, my biggest feeling is, like you say, we don't quite know everything about this yet. There could be, even with my ideas about this, there could be a group who don't have any of these dysfunctions, who are in optimal health and just happen to have slightly higher LDL. And the other thing I would probably say is that definitely mildly high LDL probably is a good thing, but the very high numbers that we see, I do question whether there's not a dysfunction behind this. But my main thrust, and the thing that I would really hope everybody takes away, is that it's worth digging a little deeper. It's worth considering, do you have a thyroid dysfunction? It's worth considering, are you eating enough calories? It's worth considering, are you stressing your body too much? Are you over-exercising? There's even probably a handful of people that have some sort of underlying, slightly unusual, maybe pituitary abnormalities, some growth hormone deficiency that's really mild, but that means that their IGF-1 levels are going to tank if they go low carb. So there's probably quite a few things, but I really feel passionately about it, because if I count myself as really lucky in the fact that I caught my husband's thyroid dysfunction, because I could easily have not, and I could have just gone on for years with him having these high cholesterol numbers and me thinking, yeah, great, he's a lean mass hyperresponder, more power to him. And we know that the effects of thyroid dysfunction on cardiovascular disease, it's not good. So I would just really urge people to dig a little deeper, see if there's another reason behind the thyroid numbers, because it is worth ruling out anything else that you could tweak. And some of these things I really wish people would experiment with a little bit more. Like, I would be really fascinated to see how many people doing OMAD, switching to 3 meals a day, holding macronutrients the same, what happens to their LDL. I'd love to see that sort of thing.
And do you have a blog that you update, or is it just that Google Doc? It's just the Google Doc?
It's just that Google Doc. That is where all my
well,
craziness.
we can link your Google Doc down below if you'd like. And I know
Be warned, it's not very ordered.
Yes, it will. The obvious caveat, it's definitely a work in progress. You've just kind of gotten into this, but that said, again, I appreciate your work in digging deeper. I can't emphasize enough that I want to feel like we have a wide spectrum of voices, that everybody can feel like they can talk openly about anything and everything, because it's the only way that we get, in my opinion, to the most relevant data, is for us to train ourselves to be as open-minded as possible and to keep exploring. I would say it's not just a matter of taking action now and dig deeper. It's a matter of never stopping digging deeper. Like, you should just get in the mode. If you take these issues seriously, let your energy apply to that seriously, because as I do often say, no one will take ownership of your health and well-being like you will.
Completely agree.
Well, thank you so much, of course, for joining us. And again, we'll have some relevant links down below. But until then, I'm sure I'll see you again in the group.
Yep. Nice speaking to you.